Chinese Premier Li Qiang warns of rising global trade tensions and protectionism, saying China aims to become a major consumption powerhouse to drive growth. And for more on the Chinese Premier's speech, CNA's Olivia Siong joins us live from Tianjin, China. Olivia, we have you there.
That's right, Grace. This was a closely watched speech by the Chinese Premier. That's right. We're just talking about the Chinese Premier's speech, which was really closely watched. It was full capacity at that opening session where we heard him say and warn countries not to turn trade into a political or security issue. And here to unpack that speech with me, I have Professor Quah, who is the economics professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Thank you for joining us, Prof.
Thank you for having me.
There is certainly a lot to unpack, even though it was a half-hour speech. What do you think was the message that the Chinese Premier was trying to send? What stood out to you?
So I thought equally important as the message was the way he packaged it. The package came in two parts. It was interwoven. One was an old school report on the state of the world, the state of the China economy. It was quite quaint to hear numbers being recited about the Chinese economy. It was going back to the day when we produced so much steel, that much coal was dug out of the ground, so much grain was harvested. But it was a modern telling. The second part, which is the more interesting part that I think your question tries to get at, was his vision of China in the world. And there were three messages there, I thought, that he wanted the world to get. One is that the world has changed profoundly because of geopolitics and technology. The second is there are principles that we used to have about the world that China and the world need to continue to hold on to. These are principles of multilateralism, globalization, and trade. And the third part of the message was that China is here. It is part of this world. One of the interesting things about this, that the world has changed, that there are principles, that China is here, this is a speech that might have been made 2 decades ago. It was a speech that had been made then, would have sat comfortably with everything that the world all over said. It would have sat comfortably with what Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and other transatlantic leaders have said. The big message here is that he gave that speech in a world that's now completely different. America has retreated from its telling of multilateralism and globalization, but China says it is here for you because these are the principles that still work.
At the same time, though, you mentioned the United States. But in that half-hour speech, if you were to listen to it carefully, not a single mention of the US, not a single mention of the Trump administration, but it seemed very thinly veiled that the message was directed at America. Would you agree?
Absolutely right. I was watching for exactly the same thing, and I thought the speech was all the more powerful for not mentioning the United States. Implicit in the idea that the world has changed, of course, everyone realizes the United States is a big part of that change. The United States economically is far less consequential in the world today than it was 2 decades ago. There was a time, and to be clear, 20 years ago, America was 25% of the global economy. It remains that today. So that's not the dimension in which it's changed. 20 years ago, the amount that China exported to the United States is almost exactly the same as what it exports to the United States today. But the world has moved on. China is far larger, the world is far larger. What used to be 25% of China's exports going to the United States is now only 13%. It's half of what it used to be. And in fact, America's position in the world is comparable to that ratio. America remains still 25% of the global economy. It consumes almost 30% of what the world consumes. But the world today trades with the rest of the world outside the United States 8 times what it does with the United States. America's trade with the world is now between 11-13% of world trade. That is a far smaller number than it used to be. So that's a very profound change. But the other thing he didn't mention, as he talked about the principles of globalization and multilateralism, is that America there has also changed. America used to support the principles of multilateralism. It does not seem to do so today. And those principles are hugely important. He didn't spell this out, but the three things that matter to us: open markets, a level playing field. That matters to us in Singapore as much as it does to China. A commitment to dispute resolution through consultation, not through the means of power. That matters to us in Singapore as much as it does to the rest of the world. Apparently, not the United States.
Was it meant to paint a direct contrast between the US and China, and perhaps a position that China is looking to fill with America retreating from the world stage?
Absolutely. I mean, you compare, video clips of the speech today with any video clip of Donald Trump at the podium addressing the world. It is like day and night. I think that it's to China's great credit that it does not hit us over the head with a hammer to say, look how different we are. But it's saying this is indeed a different world now. Whether China is positioning itself to be a leader of the world is a tricky question. China insists that it has no aspirations in that direction. I think for the rest of us, what we mean by leadership in the world does not mean imperialistic rule. It means setting the agenda, being clear about what the world needs to do, and helping us guide that conversation. Yes, it also means being the consumer of last resort, lender of last resort, but much more important is someone who gathers us around the table and says, here's a global challenge that we need to address. I think China is certainly ready to do that second part of the leadership. In fact, the world needs that second part of the leadership. But when it says China is not going to be the leader of the world, China has no aspirations to its leadership, it means it has no aspirations to its imperialistic rule. Those two sides are things that all the rest of us welcome.
So it does want to lead in certain aspects. We heard about the global south, for example, and the potential of it.
Exactly. He said, China is here in the world. We will continue to, our technological innovation will help drive global prosperity. That's a good thing. That China is here participating in conversations in the global south and BRICS, that's a good thing. All of these things help improve the well-being of the world. China, you'll also remember, he said also that China has set up initiatives to raise consumption in China. That will be a way to balance China's economy. It's not to let China become an entirely consumption-oriented economy. It's for China to balance its economy. And that too is a good thing for all the rest of us. It helps us think about how we can continue to trade with China, what things we produce, the rest of the world produce that China will want to buy. China is not going to retreat into autarky, nor is it simply going to go the way of excess capacity and simply export everything to the rest of the world.
Yeah, to what extent do you think the speech also addressed or showed awareness of the concerns that other countries may have over China? For example, you mentioned overcapacity. One of the concerns is that if China doesn't trade as much with the US, there's going to be this huge dumping of goods in other countries. Do you think there was awareness of that?
So I might change your statement slightly, if I may. America does view imports from China as problematic. It thinks of that still as part of the China shock. China stealing jobs, hollowing out its industry. For the rest of us, we need to look at this forensically. If China stands up and promises to sell us high quality goods at low prices, we should say thank you. We can use these goods and services. They are high-tech goods. You're not underpricing. You're selling them at prices that we think are fair, and we take them in and we make our economies better in the process. Of course, it is painful for those people in the same industry that China is exporting in, but that is a part of the way markets operate. It is painful, and it is incumbent upon all our governments to help ease that pain of transition. America has spent 5 decades consciously not helping ease that pain of transition. The rest of us can do that, and we would then welcome the goods from China that are coming in that are high quality and low price. we should write them a thank you note.
As you mentioned, there is the U.S. that was perhaps part of the receiver of the message that Chinese Premier wanted. But do you think there were other parties that this message was targeted at? We know that this is a room full of government leaders, business leaders, academia, influential people.
At one point, he did say, our doors, China's doors, will open ever wider for engagement with the rest of the world. He welcomes entrepreneurs, both domestic and foreign, to work with Chinese government, to work with China. So that was a message that China is here for business.
But how do you think that's going to be received? Because, as you mentioned, some of the things that the Chinese Premier said are not too different from what we've been hearing in recent times, but the context is very different. It's an increasingly volatile world, Middle East instability, trade tariffs, industrial policy has changed. How do you think that's going to be received by other parties?
I think it could potentially be misinterpreted, but China, remember, both in the speech and elsewhere, has consistently talked about win-win cooperation. He repeated, the world should not fall into thinking of itself as a zero-sum game, that we win only if you lose. Win-win cooperation is the way we will solve global problems, and win-win cooperation will expand opportunities. As you say, trade should be welcome and not viewed as a security risk. I think that on all of this, he sounds all the right notes. I think where you say there might be danger is that China is a behemoth in the world, and no matter how carefully it negotiates its actions, it has sharp elbows. And when it moves, the rest of us do feel perturbed. I think China could do a lot to reassure the rest of us. In fact, my number one candidate for China to reassure is the United States. The United States should become used to the idea that China can continue to grow and America should not feel insecure. China can help do that. It's not done that yet, but I think that would be welcomed by everyone.
Oh, we'll have to see how this unravels. Much more to come. Dark clouds, bright spots. Thank you so much, Professor Danny Quah, for helping us unpack that. I was speaking to Professor Danny Quah, economics professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore.